Okay, welcome back, painters. And thank you to Christopher F., who says, thank you for your invaluable presentations, Mr. Ingbretson. Lucas O. and John J., some of those are new, some of those are recurring. And thank you very much for keeping the faith, for helping, for helping us keep the faith. I think I mentioned before when the first thing more or less upon meeting the Gamma students and bringing them to the studio and to the Art Students League studios was to have them tell me about Leonardo's line of shadow and the and sort of it was the beginning of beginning to think about painting as, if you want to call it that, science, but at least in terms of visual data. It was the beginning of thinking things through and using logic and science, for lack of a better word. Upon seeing Gamble, I don't know, it was the first time, maybe the first time I met him, I was asking him what he recommended reading, and right at the top of his list was Leonardo's treatise on painting, and he he recommended a particular volume of, as I've said before, that is just full of everything possible, and not, it took a huge amount of figuring to find my way to the part that he was specifically talking about painting. As Leonardo is this person who spends his life analyzing everything, looking into everything. Is he a researcher? The whole thing. But he was trained from the very beginning as a painter. So, of course, he would have thought that it would have been probably the beginning of his thinking things through, was beginning to think things through painting. So I'm just going to talk about, I'm just going to show you a few of the, uh, what I call dicta, the, and Mr. Producer overruled that one. uh, for fear that people would miss it, think, wouldn't want to go there, think it's too difficult or something. Although I might be putting words in Mr. Producer's mouth on that one. um, but in any case, this. So there's two things that Leonardo does. He spends a whole lot of time talking about anatomy and just stuff related to what has historically been considered part of the visual arts. He talks about composition, mostly the composition of imaginative pictures is what he's talking about. But he talks about some very and so a big part of that is the imaginative world that everybody was living in, the storytelling picture, et cetera, et cetera. So he's telling you how to pose models, but he's also telling you about how to pose models so they're visually more intriguing to look at, more interesting. He never misses that idea of being interesting. So a whole bunch of his data, a whole bunch of his observations and suggestions are pertain to what you may as well call the impressionist mind, as much as to any mind at all. It's just the world of seeing. He talks relationships and so on. But you'll pick up on it as I go into it. And this could be long in any case, so I'm just going to go straight to his stuff. I wanted to just walk just for 2 seconds, look at his images. We may come back to one or more of them. But the Virgin of the Rocks here is one of the more famous. I mean, I'm not showing the Mona Lisa, but so that's the kind of work he does. This is not impressionism, but he's compared to Michelangelo, who's largely working. It would appear to me largely working out of his head to do his figures and that sort of thing. Uh, this Leonardo is an observer of nature. He's still working out of his head and piecing together figures and stuff like that because kids don't hold still in these poses and so on. But um, nevertheless, the thing that he brings that Michelangelo doesn't really is observation of nature, and he begins to turn it into a science. A good way of approaching making a better likeness is might be the underlying theme. of the whole body of the data that we're going to talk about here. So he's still fraught with a lot of the stuff that, look at Botticelli and others around him. There's still a fair amount of that there. But here's this one. I like this one partly because it looks relatively unfinished. Now, who knows if these are overcleaned and things like that. And it also has a sort of a classic thing not to do, which is the run-on thing here. Those sorts of things. But it's just in the way of things, developmental. You're developing either yourself as a painter and your knowledge, or and the world goes from you to finding things that they would do differently, and even coming up with their own wisdom, as it were, their aphorisms, recommendations. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. Is that what Newton said? And then, but this one here I like to show because it's got such, that thing, the science of light on an object. He's got it so down to a, and he works it out so with so much finesse. I saw this in person. I want to tell you, it was the Frick. I'm not sure who owns it now. Maybe they do. But this ermine is just one of the more wonderful bits of observation. And again, bunches of it probably pieced together because the animal wasn't holding still, and other aspects of his world of ideas come into play. But let's talk aphorisms. Let's talk whatever you want to call these. And I'm simply going to go do a bunch of them. There's a whole bunch more I could do, and I'll try to keep track of these so that I don't do the same ones a second time. But these things, for any of you who are young painters, and anybody who hasn't read them in the first place, I can tell you that what it did for me is just reading this stuff. I'm looking back at these now. I've looked back at them before, but I'm looking back at them now and knowing that huge amount of the data he provided was put to use by me, even though I didn't do anything I didn't work on it, fixate on it, memorize hard on what he said. But the common sense of what he was saying and the logic of it sticks within your brain. Just by having read through it once, with being there, being in the room, and being, as it were, acquisitive. You do have to want information when you're reading Leonardo or anybody else. You can't just read them and it's all good. You actually have to be listening. But nevertheless, I'm going to tell you that I have found that a huge part of my understanding of painting, and frankly, the whole Western world owes Leonardo. The whole development of painting in the Western world really owes Leonardo. I'd have to say simply more than anyone else. As much as we talk about Velasquez and other things, there's so much of what he's saying that just becomes routine, and you think, oh, somebody else said that. It probably started here. Another thing about Leonardo, he's like the great base of a tree, and then it has all these branches, and it keeps going out. So he may have been just this little stem or something or other at the beginning. It was such a it was so full of potential and true that it was inevitable that it would work out into greater and greater permutations. The young student should, he says, in the first place, acquire a knowledge of perspective to enable him to give every object its proper dimensions, after which it's requisite that it be under the care of an able master to accustom him by degrees to a good style of drawing the parts. Next, he must study nature in order to conform. This is the impressionist, right? To confirm and fix in his mind the reason of those precepts that he's learned. He must also bestow some time in viewing the works of various old masters to form his eye and judgment in order that he may be able to put into practice all that he's been taught. So there's everything Leonardo says is right there. I'm sorry. Everything Ang says is right here. But the first part I want to really emphasize for a second. The young student should in the first place acquire knowledge of perspective to enable him to give to every object its proper dimensions. That's where I recommend that you look at Anson Cross. What he's doing with young students is highly recommended by 70 painters of the times, the top names, including Sargent and Joseph de Camp. But he's taking a piece of glass, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But he's taking a piece of glass for the purpose of showing you how perspective works. And he takes this piece of glass and has you fix it, do your drawing, do an attempt at drawing, and then look through the glass to see how it compares. And you pick up on how perspective works. And it's very interesting because Leonardo's, at some point soon, is going to tell you to fix your head to a tree or something. He says fix your head to a frame and then draw so that your head can't move, your eyes don't move, and just draw exactly what you see. And of course, that was the way perspective came into being. Well, what I want to say about this is that my perception of what Leonardo's doing isn't to teach you the science of perspective in a sense, as much as to teach you what happens on a picture plane, which is what the science of perspective is all about. So, if you haven't dealt with this before and you're horrified of the idea of a perspective lesson, just do what he says. And I will cover that in a second. I believe that quote is also in here. But the rest of this you can understand, read for yourselves. Be under the care of an able master. This is a significant thing. He says director at some point. But he talks about studying nature. And whatever he's learned, he's supposed to refer back to nature to see if it's so. There's that scripture about the Bereans. They were thought more noble because they didn't just believe what some preacher was telling them. They went and looked at the scriptures to see if it was so. That's in this class of look at nature. Nature is the source. And for painters, this is our thing. So I'll keep going. You'll pick up on value in these things. I'm just trying to just slow it down just a little bit as we looked at them, so that and to, if you want to say, modernize some of the thought, at least modernize in the sense of bringing it up to the Boston School times or even my own times. Oh, here he says it. So take a glass as large as your paper, fasten it well between your eyes and the object you mean to draw. So here's a piece of glass. There's what I'm drawing. Maybe it's you or you, me. And there's the piece of glass. And of course, now if you really want to get perspective, you're going to have to use something with lines in it, like planes, tabletops, chairs, things like that are going to be more beneficial than a head. But even a head, if you understand, it's more nuanced. But fix it between your eye and the object you meant. Fix it. So we used to have that with Gamma. We had an easel. I believe it belonged to Cormier after a while. And it's exactly what it was, an easel with a piece of glass fixed in it. You could raise the glass up and down to where you wanted it. So when you were sitting there, it was right between you and it was perpendicular. It was your picture plane. And you were tracing on that thing. He even had it, there's even a bar that came out with a little lens on it. You could peek into the lens and never, because your eye was fixed to that bar, you could actually trace very, very precisely. So instead of fixing your head to something, you just had to look through that little pinhole. Whatever, I don't know what was in that. I've forgotten if I ever knew. Yeah, meaning by way of a lens or something. So he said, and then fixing your head in a frame in such a manner as not to be able to move it at the distance of 2 feet from the glass, shut one eye and draw with a pencil. Now 2 feet is because you want to be able to reach the glass, right? So, and draw with a pencil accurately upon the glass all that you see through it. Now, I don't know how they drew with a pencil on glass. I mean, what was a pencil? So I don't know how much of this is translation. But we these days can use a sharp Sharpie, a magic marker or one of those things, and do that. And so you can draw a very, and by the way, the thinner one you use, obviously, the better, but still will get you the idea across. So draw with a pencil accurately upon the glass all that you see through it. After that, trace upon paper what you've drawn on the glass, which tracing you may paint at pleasure. Now, the last part of this I don't find useful, but read the Anson Cross stuff. So I think it's Drawing and Painting Self-Taught, probably where that is located. But he's just following, remember, the Anson Cross is just following up on what Leonardo is saying, and so is Gamma with that easel he had, by Robert Cormier, who was one of his students back in the 50s. Here we go, Leonardo. The organ of sight is one of the quickest and takes in at a single glance an infinite variety of forms. Now that's the big impression, isn't it? Notwithstanding which, it cannot perfectly comprehend more than one object at a time. So there again, I'm telling you that what we do is we're always comprehending the whole, but we always have to draw one thing at a time. Now, if I didn't get that from Leonardo, I don't know where I did. But I used to say we draw like an ant, but we think like God, so you have this grand view of what it is, the ensemble of what it is you're looking at here. You can see it, you can feel it all. but we only get to make one mark at a time. How do you do that? So you can't perfectly comprehend more than one object at a time. For example, the reader at one look over this page immediately perceives it full of different characters, but he cannot at the same moment distinguish each letter, much less can he comprehend their meaning. He must consider it word by word, line by line. And by the way, that's why phonics is so important. You learn to read by the sound of each letter from left to right. There's a system to the whole thing. And letters have sounds, and you're sounding out. Each letter has matters. You know what I mean? So so he has to consider it word by word, line by line, if he be desirous of forming a just notion of these characters. And just notion really does mean one that is appropriate to the whole. In like manner, if we wish to ascend to the top of an edifice, we must be content to advance step by step, unless we shall never be able to obtain it. So that's step by step by step. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a step. A young man who has a natural inclination to the study of this art, I would advise to act thus. In order to acquire a true notion of the form of things, he must begin by studying the parts which compose them, and not pass to a secondary till he has well stored his memory and sufficiently practiced the first. Otherwise, he loses his time and will most certainly protract his studies. And let him remember to acquire accuracy before he attempts quickness. Now, that's a classic, right? And many people say that, but don't give Leonardo credit for that. By the way, who knows before him, right? By the way, was Verrocchio really quite a remarkable painter who brought Leonardo to this sort of thinking? He must have been on some level, or somebody around Leonardo was, but maybe it was Verrocchio himself, who had such an interesting influence on numbers of people. Verrocchio was the person in whose studio Leonardo worked when he was young. So a young man, he says, he must begin by studying the parts which compose them. And at some other points he talks about, maybe he does here, he's talking about, so here are the parts. Say the form of bodies is divided into two parts. That is the proportion of the members to each other, which must correspond with the whole, and the motion, expressive of what passes in the mind of the living figure. That's the gesture and the proportions. He's talking about those parts, and he's talking about isolating parts like that. But he could, at another time, he talks about the parts meaning the value, or the color rather, and the shape. And I don't know, that may come up again, but have in mind that he's talking about the parts. So if you know that painting is broken down into the values issues, the color issues, which have value contingencies, right, and the shape issues, which is, so most people just say line, value, and color. Most people will break it down that way as time goes by, but here's the beginning of that thinking, right? Can how do you break a bundle of sticks is always that back to that one stick at a time. So he's just simply referring to that without using that aphorism, which goes back to the Greeks, I believe. I think Alexander was where you first see it in writing, maybe. The ground which surrounds the figures in any painting ought to be darker than the light of those figures and lighter than the shadowed part. So when we set up casts in the studio, what we were doing under Gamel, we would set it up. By the way, the Art Students League was so chaotic. There was not even a discussion of that sort of thing. But when you set up a cast, we were to set it up with a ground, middle tone ground, such that the lights would make a silhouette against that tone, and the darks would make a silhouette. So the tone would be lighter behind in one case and darker behind in the other case, and they would produce silhouettes. And we learned how to manage it so that one of the silhouettes might be just a little stronger than the other one because you didn't want equality, and it's more interesting. The equality of power. So if you either want the light side to pop more or you want the wall, so we say on the other side to pop more. The latter is an unlikely situation, isn't it? But now this one, when people are setting up still lifes, this one comes into play very quickly. And this, I included the chapter heading. It says how to detach and bring forward figures out of their background. If your figure be dark, place it on a light ground. So you may have heard me say that I try to get you guys to set up casts with a light to dark background, so that when you set things out there that you're thinking about using, you would set them out in a way that they would silhouette. So If it's a dark thing, you can put it against a middle tone or light background, but don't put it against a dark background because you just lose it. So what is his expression there? If you want it to detach and come forward, if it be light upon a dark ground, by the way, or if you want to see it, just simply see its shapes. There's a thing about forward and back is a whole other story and an important one. But you can see how much he's talking about. He's talking about the entire world, but how many people put this sort of thing into such usable terms and malleable terms, that is, say terms. I don't mean malleable in the sense that they're ambiguous. I mean in the sense that they can be developed and refined. This is really useful material that you can build on. So if your figure be dark, place on a light ground. If it be light upon a dark ground, if it be partly light and partly dark, as is generally the case, contrive that the dark part of the figure be on the light part of the ground and the light side of it against the dark. I think I mentioned to you, I was looking at one of the shots from my daughter's wedding, and I noticed with jealousy that her husband's silhouette with a top hat and stuff was against light, and he stuck right out. And my daughter's head was against some middle tone thing, and you couldn't find her face. That's the sort of thing, if you want it to feature in any way, you're going to be paying attention to the idea of silhouetting. Never mind the fact, by the way, so that forces him, allows them to be more all there. But it's also just simply more the silhouette. And Degas says it's all silhouette. That may be a reference to these quotes as well. You can see how fertile this is, though, right? Everybody you ever hear talking about painting, there's an element of his certainty that seems to go right back to believing or having found true the sayings of Leonardo. Well, here it is. In drawing from relievo, the draftsman must place himself in such a manner as that the eye of the figure to be drawn be level with his own. Now, when I start studios up in students up in my studios, I set them up so the cast is across from their eyes, and I set them up with a drawing across from their eyes, so their eye motion is just like this. If you listen to Leonardo here, just do it, and you'll see how it works out. That's working it out yourself to see if he's right and what benefit is. But if when there's a certain randomness when you go in there and you draw something, you just set your drawing down here, you just have it on your lap, and you're trying to draw what you see. But once you can see it side by side, and that again back to the Meldrum thing, which is certainly coming from this way of thinking, you want to be able to see if it would just, if it just is the same thing, right? So if it just, and I don't mean that in a sight-size way, but most of you would know what I mean by that. So that they would appear to merge into each other easily, and just be of a piece as if they were part of the other one. The drawing with nature, that part you're drawing. So draw at a level with your eyes. It's very practical stuff. Accustom yourself to hold a plummet in your hand. That's just plain Sargent. You think Sargent didn't read all these things? And everybody else, by the way. But accustom yourself to hold a plummet. He could have said in your left hand, except he was a left-hander, that you may judge of the bearing of the parts. Now, bearing is like a ship. It's bearing north by northwest or something. You know what I mean? I'm using that. He's using the term in a way that's rather like that. So the bearing of the parts, that's the angle. That would be, is it shooting off this way or shooting off this way and so on. So the plumb tells you these things, right? You can make it a better assessment of the bearing. That plumb is sort of your North Star. I say it's the god of all angles, is vertical. When you draw from nature, you must be at a distance of 3 times the height of the object. How many times have my students? They've all heard me say this. And there's 2 aspects of it. One is his conversation goes on at some other point to say that it's about distortion. It's about perspective distortion. Like if the camera gets too big, my ears disappear and I appear to have my face does some weird stuff, right? And body parts do and that sort of thing. If you get too close, my feet will look like they're a mile away. They'll look so teeny. If you have a lens, it'll cover all that. So getting back 3 times the height of the object, so we call it the greatest dimension of the object. Now that's for perspective, but there's another thing that we say, and this adding to this, or I can't recall whether he said that. He did say there is a proper viewing distance for painting. That'll come up in a second. And that probably has to do with the next thing I'm going to say, but that is get back far enough so you can see all the parts of your painting at the same time. And then that becomes rather the proper viewing distance. So these are very practical things. Do these things, do them consistently. You'll find the benefit. It's just, there's benefit. And that's, Benson talking about to his daughter, saying about how if, these kinds of behaviors in the studio, if you don't adhere to them, you're going to be hurting yourself. You're not going to give yourself the same opportunity to succeed. So, and here he goes, when you begin to draw, form in your own mind a certain principal line, suppose a perpendicular. Observe well the bearing, again, of the parts toward that line, whether they intersect, are parallel to it, or oblique. So that could suppose a particular perpendicular, but doesn't automatically mean a perpendicular. It may not be visually. I like this because it suggests that there's a visual thing there in painting that you can use. Something in painting already. It may be just a dramatic, very like sort of straightest line that maybe picks up twice more, that sets up a very clear angle that you can easily use for reference for getting other. And again, he's talking about the bearing of the parts. So you're beginning to observe how they relate to it. So if you have an angle that's the strong angle, and you get that to be right to vertical, shall we say, and then because it's so strong and readable, you start relating all the angles to it. You can see where one of them is tilts in toward it, would intersect, or you can say where the others will tend to go away or would intersect at the other end, shall we say. There's just many ways to use your mind as well as your eyes, but this just gets you to be using it. Be in your what should we say? When I stopped thinking, I stopped painting. Who said that? I believe it was Rembrandt of all people, huh? I've experienced, this is again a Sargent related one. I've experienced no small benefit when in the dark and in bed by retracing the outlines of those forms which I had previously studied, particularly such as had appeared the most difficult to comprehend and retain. Now that right there, before I even finish what he's saying, what is this about comprehending and retaining? This is the use of the memory. You're trying to grasp a thing in your memory that you're drawing. At least Sargent says, draw the longest line that you can remember. That's the memorized line. That's the learned line. You see it, you grasp it. So, but those are the ones he would be at the end of the day trying to remember, trying to recall. If you remember, Sargent was doing this and found benefit in it. How many of us, just having read Leonardo as the first really useful, tangible source, wound up with these things just in our heads, And I remember being a young student and really wanting to apply these things, but somehow having this big vacancy between performance and a recognition of the value of the comments. By this method, they will be confirmed and treasured up in the memory. I don't know why there's a question mark on that. So a painter ought not certainly to refuse listening to the opinion of anyone. For we know that although a man be not a painter, he may have just notions of the forms of men, whether a man has a hump on his back, a thick leg, or a large hand, whether he be lame or have any other defect. So if he's looking at your painting, you'd say, why'd you make him lame? That would be a useful thing, wouldn't it be? Now, if we know that men are able to judge of the works of nature, should we not think them more able to detect our errors? So that's what you're using a fresh eye from a fresh guy for. And again, what does that quote from? But reference to this. But yeah, but the one codicil, I remember, I forget who said it. Might have been Gemmell himself. He said, just avoid the amateur who thinks he knows something about painting. Don't have him look at your stuff. You really do want the opinion of just the anyone guy. I say the layman, the guy who doesn't play around in our field. Yeah. And I suppose that would be true for writers or anybody else. So if you wish to make good and useful studies, use great deliberation in your drawings. Observe well among the lights, which and how many hold the first rank in point of brightness, and so among the shadows. Do you understand that's the visual order right there? I don't remember ever reading this with that concept in mind, but the first rank in order of brightness, in point of brightness, that's where Meldrum comes from as well. Just don't you see how he begins the science that relates to painting? The ways of identifying data and then thinking them through, especially in their relationships. First rank in point of brightness is a relational process. And so among the shadows, which are the darker than others. And so this is your darkest dark and lightest lights. This is keying. The angle one is keying, right? And in what manner they blend together. Compare the quality. Now, what manner they blend together. Fascinating, right? Is that the lost and found world? Compare the quality and quantity of one with the other. Now, there's another one. So we talk about, is this a dark picture with lights flopping through it, or is it a light picture dominatingly with dark being a minor participant, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see what I mean? Observe to what part they compare the quality and quantity of one with the other, and observe to what part they're directed. Ha! Be careful also in your outlines or divisions of the members. Remark well what quantity of parts are to be on the one side and one on the other. And now this is the body itself, presumably, and where they're more or less apparent or broad or slender. Lastly, take care that the shadows and lights be united or lost in each other. Oh, there's the word, actually lost. Take care that the shadows and lights be united or lost in each other. Now that's in the light side, that's breadth, getting the unity of the light. Or in the shadow side, that's going to give you the atmosphere, making sure that when you blur your eye and all the little parts inside that shadow area tend to disappear, that on your painting the same thing happens. And you will have created the just relationships of that stuff in those areas. I mean, who could think through much? This guy just sat there using his eyes. Um, and now, without any hard strokes or lines, now this one, as smoke loses itself in the air, so are your lights and shadows to pass from one to the other without any apparent separation. That is the sfumato thing, the smoke-like um, uh, um, metaphor, the smoke metaphor for the middle tones, for the joint. What did Gamble say about that? He talked about the battleground between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. I don't know where that comes from. I don't think that's Leonardo. But that great middle tone work is just such a significant amount of work through the middle tones. There's so much variation. The smoke is just doing this and it's drifting, disappearing and coming back to life, forming up again. To paint well from nature, your window should be to the north, that the lights may not vary. Now that's your rationale for north light. You don't want the sun to come in. However, he says, if it be to the south, you must have paper blinds that the sun in going round may not alter your shadows. That's something I've never heard of except from Leonardo. The situation of the light should be such as to produce upon the ground a shadow from your model as long as it is high. So he's commending a 45-degree angle so that the height of this thing here, the shadow over here, would be the same. If the light came in this way, the shadow would come out to that distance. Okay, that's different. I want to say that I believe that Reynolds is recommending a 30-degree light, if I remember right, which means that the light would be significantly further out. Anyway, but there you are. The use of how high should your windows be, and by the way, your manipulation of the height of the window, if you have blinds, I guess, that you can pull up from the bottom and elevate the light more, or if you can pull down from the top and lower the light, or if you can pull down from, whatever you want mobility, get a big enough light where you can change that angle so that when you're doing something closer, and by the way, doing something closer, you might want to reduce the size of that anyway because the brightness can be a factor in keeping you from producing an inky painting. But you see what a delight these things are and how practical they are in your studio. Those shadows which in nature are undetermined, and here we go again, is this the lost? And the extremities of which can hardly be perceived, because that's that smoky edge of a penumbra, are to be copied in your painting in the same manner, never to be precisely finished, but left confused and blended. I must have learned this at his, shall we say, at his knee. But it took a while for me to realize that you only had to draw a thing as well as it presented itself. You try to make things show that don't show. I remember I had a student once who said she was trying to show the nuances when I asked why these were overstated. I was trying to show the nuances. Well, the very nature of nuances is not to show. It would be difficult of assessment. This apparent neglect, see what I mean? Don't be doing a lot of extra work in there. So that very much has to do with the mindset of the impressionist when we talked about when you're just doing broken color, to suggest the leaves for a while. And whether or not you're going to go into them, we'll see about that. But that apparent neglect of drawing 400 leaves will show great judgment and be the ingenious result of your observation of nature. Whoa. Good stuff, just good stuff. And I'm going to recommend it with and end this with that one, and just recommend it. I'll go back and look at his pictures as I say sayonara, but I'm going to keep going the wrong way here. I'm going to recommend this book. All I'm doing here is trying to get you to start reading. If you're not a reader, become a reader. This is this is where the brain starts getting involved with the eyes, and then you become a more complete soul, and you become more of a master. Yet the potential is just huge. Again, I just refer you to this delightful piece of work, which is I don't remember it being anything like as dirty as this looks. And of course, again, the internet is being what it is. But I do remember this astonishing movement of light across the ermine, and I believe even down the sleeve of the woman holding the ermine. And I just remember being rather staggered by the subtlety of it, you know. But all the lessons, take them here. The lighting lessons. Here's a case of the silhouetting his head against the light back there, and his nose over here, making his ear pop out here. That has to do with wanting to show something, to separate it from the background, which really means to show it, right? Now, I don't know about what's happening back here. That's a lost area, lots of lostness down in through here. So I have a feeling this isn't that lost, and I just don't recall it having what I call true lostness. But I wanted to show it simply because of this whole idea of the midtones, this sfumato, and how just look how he studies. There's the sharper edge here, gradually getting to that point where it's just almost inexpressible, almost doesn't do anything, and how much attention he's paying to the shift, the nuanced shift in the midtones that he talks about in so many words. But there's so much more. There's so much more that all I can say is, you know, read it. If you haven't read it, you haven't begun your education in painting. Okay. And by the way, and that means that even if you're an imaginative painter, such as he primarily was, um, uh, maybe in that world you even have more to learn. I didn't talk about any of those aspects of it where he's talking about things that have to do with storytelling or whatever, or composition by way of figures. That's a whole other discussion. But his just subtle reference to something that I would call spotting the distribution of lights, the proportion of the lights, that's all the beginning of the eyeball stuff. And I say the beginning only because nobody else really talked about it. So, and that's another thing I say about what I'm doing. I'm trying to put words to things so that you're not expressionless. You have something to actually work with when you're using your mind to become a better painter and to see better, to understand better. I say to students sometimes, talk about what you're seeing. Talk to yourself. Use words. My wife, I don't know what it is about the male voices or our words, but when I can't find a word for something, my wife is very fond of saying, use your words. But I would recommend we follow her advice and use our words. Uh, all right. I know you all think I'm not never deficient in words. Okay. Do enjoy. I really want to hear from you. There's so much good stuff in this thing. So I want to thank you again for your wonderful donations this time. Christopher C., Lucas O., and John J. Um, it really it really does make a difference over here. So keep those coming in if you can, and if you can't, I still hope that what I'm offering is of some benefit uh, to you all. Again, thank you all for sharing, subscribing, liking, and all the rest. Do keep comments, especially practical comments in this direction. Anything you want to discuss that comes with this kind of practice is what I'm talking about. We're trying to get you to the level of mastery of the visual impression as the beginning of your education, and anything I can do to help that to happen. And of course, I always say I'm just merely, in one sense, an exponent of the Boston School for the sake of showing you to some degree what it's not in a lot of the new realist world, but just to account for, um, uh, uh, a, a misunderstanding. No, not account for, but as much as to avoid a misunderstanding and to get clarity about, being specific. Don't get confused with making imaginative painting and learn to see. And then don't get confused with imaginative work in history painting. Leonardo is always talking about history painting. Don't get confused about the difference between history painting and painting from life. They're two different things, and they're very interesting crossovers. But it can be really confusing if you don't accept that there are two different worlds. Oh, there's so much more. That was fun. All right, good guys. I hope you have a great painting week, and maybe this will help you, and to do so. We'll see you next time.